Good evening, everyone. My name is Nick Falk with the Alexander Hamilton Society here at George Washington University. We want to welcome you all to our Perils and Possibilities, U.S.-India Relations in the Context of Great Power Competition event, featuring Dr. Daniel Markey and Dr. Robert Sutter. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few announcements. First, we are carefully tracking attendance tonight, so if you haven't already done so, please make sure that you are signed in at the desk outside immediately after the event. I also want to announce that we are finishing our weekly reading series on Dr. Matthew Koenig's book, The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy, next Thursday, April 18th at 8 p.m. Additionally, next week on Monday, April 17th, from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m., we will be continuing our discussion on South Asia with a professor roundtable event featuring Dr. Laura D'Antonio from the GW Business School, who will be presenting her research regarding the rise of India in the global business market. Lastly, AHS is happy to announce that we will be co-hosting an event about the Israel-Palestine conflict in cooperation with the Israel Policy Forum, the Onero Institute, and the Elliott School. Stay tuned for more information about that event. If you would like to participate in any of these programs, learn more, please speak to an executive board officer at the table outside immediately after the event. Also tonight, we will be having a question and answer period from the audience following our speakers' remarks. However, you should know that we are recording the event, so if you do ask a question, it will be recorded. Finally, on a personal note, this will be the last major AHS speaker event for myself, our chapter president, Jake Maynard, and our director of communications, Parker Phillips. We are graduating in May, and we are proud to have seen how much AHS has grown and to become one of GW's preeminent international affairs student organizations. So thank you to the Alexander Hamilton Society for giving us these past 4 years. Now I would like to introduce our speakers tonight. We are very lucky to be able to host Dr. Daniel Markey and Dr. Robert Sutter for a conversation about the future of US-India relations in the context of great power competition and India's domestic political developments. Dr. Markey is a senior advisor on South Asia at the United States Institute of Peace, and he is also a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies Foreign Policy Institute. He is also a former senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and taught in the Department of Politics at Princeton University, where he served as the executive director of Princeton's research program in international security. From 2003 to 2007, Dr. Markey was a member of the State Department's policy planning staff, where his work focused on US strategy in South Asia, especially in India and Pakistan. And Dr. Markey received his bachelor's from Johns Hopkins and his doctorate from Princeton. Our other speaker and moderator for tonight is Dr. Robert Sutter, a professor of practice of international affairs at the Elliott School. In addition to his illustrious academic career as a China expert, Dr. Sutter has also spent over 30 years in public service. During that time, he served as a senior specialist and director of the Foreign Affairs and National Defense Division of the Congressional Research Service. He has also served as the National Intelligence Officer for East Asia and the Pacific at the National Intelligence Council, the China Division Director at the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and professional staff member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Dr. Sutter received his PhD from Harvard. The line on his resume that is most important to us, however, is that Dr. Sutter serves as our faculty advisor for AHS at GW. So thank you, Dr. Sutter, for all the support you have given us. We really appreciate it. We are all very lucky to be able to hear from these two incredible individuals tonight, so please give them a round of applause.
Well, thanks very much, Nicholas. It's really, and you and your colleagues have done a terrific job. So I hope you leave GW feeling that you have done a very good job. So congratulations to you. It's a wonderful opportunity for me to be here to learn from Dr. Markey about India and U.S.-India relations. Thank you all for coming. My job is to ask a few questions and make a few comments. And in the beginning, I want to make some comments that will broaden the scope a bit from, although they'll still stay on U.S.-India relations, I'm sure. But we will go a little broader in various ways. This is a period of remarkable change. I know you all know that we're in a period of tremendous change in the world order. And this is underlined by the war in Ukraine, this is an unexpected development from the point of view of many. And it's had a defining aspect to it that has reinforced the acute U.S. rivalry with China to the point that we're now looking at an order that on the one side is the United States and most of the Western powers, and on the other side you have Russia and increasingly China on that side. And it's very competitive. And so what you find is that last year, Mr. Biden, the President of the United States, was very active in all sorts of areas. And he's been leading this coalition dealing with the resistance that the Ukrainian people are putting up against the Russian aggression. And he's getting a lot of support for that. And it gives him a high profile in a lot of different ways. And so in Asia, he was very active in Asia at the latter part of last year. And he really outshone the Chinese leader, Mr. Xi Jinping, who was just emerging from his self-isolation because of the strict COVID restrictions that China imposed on his travel. Now he is very active. Now he is on the march, if you will. And he's very busy showing initiatives and building alignments of various sorts in competition with the United States, direct competition with the United States. And so it's in this context that I look at the situation and I say, well, what are they doing? Well, various countries are lining up with China and Russia. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is expanding. The BRICS, this is the 5 countries of the BRICS, that's expanding. The head of Brazil will be in China very soon, underlining that point. And so we have this very active approach. And of course, the Chinese are very active in the Middle East and elsewhere. And the upshot of this is that India is on both sides. India is in a very strange position. They're with the United States in the quadrilateral dialogue, which is the most active U.S. endorsed group dealing with Indo-Pacific issues. And at the same time, they're in the BRICS and the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So India is a key power, and where India is going to go in this kind of situation is something that I'm taking notes tonight. When Dr. Markey speaks, I'm going to take a lot of notes because this is I don't know the answer to this, and I think it's I really don't have a good idea, and so it's in that context of sort of wonder that given the circumstances, India's position just seems to be so important right now. So with that as by way of introduction, I'd like Dr. Markey to start us off, please.
Absolutely. First, let me just begin by thanking my hosts and AHS generally. It's really great to be here and to see such a great audience this evening. I understand it's a busy time of the semester, so thank you for coming and for listening. And then let me also thank Professor Sutter for kicking things off. No surprise, he asked a really, really hard question just at the outset, but it's a great framing question. And it's actually a question that I have given some thought to, and now that I'm at the U.S. Institute of Peace, which is your neighbor, by the way, just across the street from the State Department, if you haven't visited us, and where I have opportunities to routinely travel to India, discuss these kinds of issues with Indian counterparts, and also occasionally have interesting conversations, most recently virtually, with Chinese experts on South Asia, as well as many, many Americans. I begin to form my own impressions that way, as well as through my research on where India is going. And that is a huge question. And I think one way to think about it, the way Professor Sutter has pointed out, is that certainly here in Washington, we have gone from, say, 5 or 10 years ago, a period in which we either saw the world as best understood through a kind of an emerging multipolarity, or some people made up new words like non-polarity or Basically the idea was we didn't quite know, aside from the United States being a major power and by a number of measures still a superpower, we didn't really know what was going to happen with the evolution of the rest of the world order. Certainly some saw the rise of China as being increasingly important, but it wasn't yet the dominant or defining feature of world order in the way that I think it has started to become here in Washington, where now if you kind of did a back of the envelope survey of American foreign policy experts and relevant folks in and out of government, you'd say that basically the consensus has shifted to seeing the world through a bipolar lens. And increasingly the question is sort of, are you on the more or less Chinese side of the ledger, or are you on the more or less US side of the ledger? And then you can be none of the above, but it's increasingly looking more and more that the none of the above has a lot in common with the non-aligned movement of the Cold War. And at least that's the way it's being more and more framed. Now, coming to India. India was very comfortable with the idea of an evolving world order that was increasingly multipolar. In fact, you really couldn't come up with a better vision for India's future, because India is an enormous country in terms of population, but still very much, you would say, a rising power, and in many ways a developing country, and economy, and what is experienced by many of its own people in terms of gaps between where India is and where the developing West is. They're still quite wide, but India is growing, becoming increasingly important, and I would say for a good 20 plus years, enjoyed a world in which you could be friends with everybody. This was a very accommodating world from an Indian perspective, where you could buy relatively inexpensive and pretty high quality arms from Russia, where you could buy up until, well, I don't know, it got harder with the nuclear issue in Iran, but you could buy oil from Iran and Saudi Arabia. You could be friends with Israel. You'd be increasingly good friends with the United States and with Western Europe, and even have an enormous trading relationship and a pretty solid relationship with China, all at once. And if you're sitting in New Delhi and you're trying to imagine a world that would be open to India's rise, and even supportive of it, as the United States has been for roughly 2 decades in many different ways, we can get into that if you like, but if you were sitting in India, this was your ideal world order in which you could navigate and chart a path that was both independent and basically benefited from all the good things that anybody had on offer, with relatively few direct threats to India. I mean, Pakistan being one, but in an existential sense, not a terrible threat. And I will say, China was not perceived up until 5+ years ago as a significant threat to India either. So that was the world that India was in. And now I think we are in a new world. And it's not just Washington that's appreciating this. I think this is increasingly felt in New Delhi as well, but not for the same reasons. So where the United States is increasingly focused on a globalized competition with China as, in many ways, increasingly a peer competitor, India has China as a neighbor, and as a direct land border neighbor, and one that looks increasingly threatening in terms of that border, which is contested and very long and very difficult to defend from India's perspective. So India has a very direct material concern about what China is doing along its border. It has, and I'd like to talk about this more as we go, I don't want to filibuster at the outset, but India, I think, has a fairly rapidly evolving view as to what its competition with China means and where India should fit within it. But there's one thing that I'll conclude with is India is not yet at the point where it has decided that it will cast its lot entirely with the United States. So Professor Sutter made the exactly right point that India can, in the same year, host the G20, have a series of important bilateral and We call them mini-lateral meetings, that is of the Quad, meetings that include the United States and other close US partners. And yet also in that same year hosts the Shanghai Cooperation Organization major forum as well, which includes Russia and China, and will be held in India. All in the same year, and India sees both of these, as well as its leadership in the developing world or the global south, as something that it's also attempting to maneuver. So India continues to want to have it all. I think that's becoming increasingly challenging, but you can understand why, and you can understand why they have every incentive to try to keep that game going for as long as they can. So let me leave it there, and we can delve further into these issues as you like.
Yeah, well, that's great. Thank you so much. What I would like to...
Your mic.
Oh, yeah, my mic, right. Thank you very much. What I would like to delve into on a specific measure has to do with the United States. When U.S. leaders would go to India, or U.S. would give statements about relations with India, they would constantly say they favored a stronger India. In my experience, looking at U.S. documents that deal with other countries, they usually don't say that. We are committed to having a much stronger India. And so that's a real commitment. So it looks like, whereas you look at India and you say, well, they're sort of holding back, and they want to keep their relationships with Russia and so forth, and Iran and this type of thing. Is the relationship in U.S.-Indian relations asymmetrical? The U.S. is the seeking the better relationship. I mean, this has been going on for over 20 years, and so I'm just asking that pattern seems to have emerged, and I just wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, there are a number of people, and there was a meeting at the Council on Foreign Relations. It was public. I think you can find the video online where people were asking the question, including a former ambassador, Bob Blackwell, was asking the question, should India want the relationship with the United States more than the United States wants the relationship with India? Kind of exactly to your point. His conclusion was that India should recognize that the value of partnership with America was a great deal more than they seem to appreciate, and that, quite frankly, the United States needed India less than India needs the United States. So that was his position. But there's a longer story here, which is the history that you're describing, really, of the United States supporting India's rise dates back to the more or less early Bush administration, that is George W. Bush, after the Clinton administration had a kind of a breakthrough at the end of the Cold War with India. There was a setback of India's nuclear tests in 1998, but by the time the Bush administration came in, they were committed to building a stronger relationship with India. And the logic behind that was multifold. It wasn't simply a story of the Bush administration appreciating the rise of China, seeing India as a strategic counterweight, and seeking to use India as a counterbalance to China. It was a little more complicated than that. It was also that they recognized that India had as yet untapped potential economically and potentially in other ways as well. And so India had value in its own right. Forget about China. It was a huge Asian country that had done a great deal less with the United States than the administration thought it should have or thought it could. And India had a remarkable appeal as a democracy. Right? So it was in many ways the not China of Asia. Huge, potentially powerful, and not quite there yet, but also a messy democracy, and one that seemed to have, as was described at the time, as a potential to be a natural ally of the United States. So that was the driver, that was the motive force. All of these pieces were necessary to basically spur some of the early breakthroughs in the relationship, which ultimately culminated in a civil nuclear deal. That is, an arrangement by the Bush administration and then the Obama administration to break a lot of rules about dealing with India on nuclear, civilian nuclear capabilities, rules that have been put in place specifically to constrain India's nuclear program in the past. They were changed. And the United States did that precisely for the reason you're identifying, which is we wanted to enable India's rise because we saw it as potentially valuable. To make a long story short, what I think has happened over time is that we've continued to see India as potentially valuable. It's been 20 years, but now the story looks more like a China-focused story than even it did at the outset. And there were some at the outset who saw it that way, but I would say it's really shifted in that direction. So we have seen a great deal of action on the military, to some extent some technology sharing, other arrangements that enable security cooperation with India. We've seen some progress on the economic side of things, but not maybe as much as we would have liked. And politically, there's been a little bit of backsliding, and there's a little less confidence in U.S. policymaking circles about India and its place as a strong, obvious, natural democratic partner in Asia. So the contours of the expectations for the relationship have shifted a bit, but this desire to see India grow and become more powerful, more capable with U.S. help is very strong. And I'll just end on the note that the Biden administration, as much as any administration ever, has taken this up with enormous energy and has pushed it forward, even more than I would have expected. You mentioned the Quad, that is India along with Australia and Japan and the United States coming together has been a real area of energy and focus for the White House, but also a series of bilateral meetings that have gotten a lot of attention. And we're expecting to see others. I anticipate, at least what I've heard, Modi is contemplating a trip here to Washington. That would be another big step along the way.
This is great. Thank you very much. I have a small point that maybe I'll come back to later, and that has to do with the concern about nuclear weapons proliferation and how the dynamic of the U.S.-India relationship, as you alluded to, really took off in the end, at the end of the Clinton administration, precisely because of these tests. In other words, that they were tests of nuclear weapons. In what was it, 1998? Was India and Pakistan each one set off several nuclear weapons. It was really shocking. And immediately, the United States engaged more rigorously with India. In other words, you had this Stroh-Talbot relationship with the Indian leaders, and so, in other words, they were more solicitous of the Indians, and they accepted the fact that India had these nuclear weapons. Well, there is a country in the northeastern part of Asia that looks at this with great interest. That's just what they want. It's called North Korea, and they want an India deal. They want to see the behavior of the United States change, and to recognize they have nuclear weapons and to support them afterward. That pattern prevailed then. So I'm not. It's a small point, but
no, it's an interesting point.
But it shows it showed the incentive on part of the United States to improve its relationship with India.
Absolutely, the warming began before, in the Clinton administration, but really began before the tests. The tests were something of a setback, but you're absolutely right. That setback didn't last long, and you're again right that the temporary nature of that setback really did reflect this underlying assessment, then by the Clinton administration, and I think driven by this idea of India as having this vast potential in Asia. Well, the world looked very different back then. We're talking about globalization and opportunities for economic and business relations with India especially, but the strategic component was recognized, and whether it was Stroh-Talbot or subsequently, there was an understanding in Washington among U.S. policymakers that unless they changed the rules of the nuclear game with India, they would not find a way toward warmer ties with India. That this was like a fundamental obstacle to closer relations, and at that time the United States was that eager to pursue them. The nuclear deal still was a surprise. I mean, I say this because I happened to be working at the State Department at the time, and even probably the strongest proponents of a nuclear deal with India were still, I think, a bit surprised that they were able to get so much traction so quickly on it. It was a huge breakthrough and a real sea change in terms of what was possible in the relationship that shocked a lot of people.
Well, let's shift to the present, and what do you expect from India's leadership of the G20 and the summit meeting? I mean, it could be very awkward. The one in Indonesia was awkward because of the Ukraine issue and the differences between Russia and the other participants in many cases. And now that's been accentuated. China is on Russia's side in a very strong way now. So what do you think about that?
I think we've already gotten a bit of a taste of how it could be, as you're saying, that the G20 throughout this year and then the actual summit in the fall could really be disrupted by the war in Ukraine. And I think this is exactly the opposite of what India is hoping from the G20. And to give you a little flavor on that, the current Indian government, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, is very, very eager to portray this year as, in fact, the year of India. The year of Indian statesmanship, the year that India shows the world that it can lead on a variety of fronts, and the year that India hosts countries from around the world for major summits like the ones we've discussed. And this is a huge opportunity, or perceived as a huge opportunity, even more, I mean, when you think about it, not that many countries play it up that much when they host the G20. I mean, you know, it happens, but India has turned this into a major event for both, I think, actual diplomatic reasons, that India wants to show that it can do a good job, but also very much for domestic political reasons. So India's Prime Minister wants to use his statesmanship in the context of the G20 to show the people of India that he's doing a great job on precisely those things, and to play to their nationalism and their patriotism in the context of upcoming national elections the subsequent year. So there's a political dynamic and there's a real diplomatic dynamic, and unfortunately on both fronts, this disastrous, in my view, war in Ukraine, disastrous for Russia so far mainly, but also for people who are suffering through it, but is also likely to be disastrous for India's diplomatic plans, because the countries who are involved in the G20 are more likely to hijack the proceedings and to use it as a forum for debating amongst themselves. And India's ability to control that is limited. It's not really in charge just because it's hosting. And so its agenda, which might naturally have shifted to other issues, global public health or climate change or concerns about the global south, giving voice to the global south, these were all things that were on India's agenda, may well be shoved to the side. And you know, to go slightly beyond that, to the extent that Russia and China appear increasingly to be aligned with one another, is also, going back to what I was saying at the outset, also an Indian nightmare. This is the opposite of what India would like to see, particularly as China looks more threatening. To see Russia, again, to simplify, a principal provider of arms to India, to see a principal provider of arms to India align itself increasingly with China, maybe be more vulnerable to the Chinese, is something that is very worrisome from India's perspective. So both the G20 and that alignment look kind of ugly from an Indian perspective, and it's something they'll be working hard to avoid, but have limited leverage in order to do so.
Tell us more about the India agenda on the global south and climate change. And India, you know, has a poor record on climate change. And what would they seek? What would they seek to promote?
Well, you know, India does have a long history of, through the non-aligned movement during the Cold War, of wanting to portray itself, if not always actually accomplishing this aim of being a leader within the developing world. And you know, there's an opening for this, in part because China, also a contender or a wannabe leader within the global south, is increasingly a developed country. And not all of China's concerns in terms of development, economic development, are shared by countries of the global south in ways they might have been decades ago. India, as I mentioned earlier, is still in many ways a developing country, still facing a number of challenges in terms of economic development that look a great deal like other parts of the global south. And so India, I think, feels that it has a natural convergence of interests and potentially leadership to offer to give more voice to that. And on issues like climate change, of course, there's a trade-off to be made in terms of how the world grapples with the problem of climate change, who should pay, how progress should be made. And India, I think, in many ways sees itself as the natural bearer of that voice, to bring that voice to global forums like the G20. So I think that's, in a way, in a nutshell, how I would. There's obviously more complexity, though. India has made pledges about climate change pledges of its own. India has already moved to do a great deal in the area of solar power and so on, renewables. So there's a great deal of desire to green India internally. And if you care about climate change, there's a real necessity to do so, simply because of the size of the population, the rapidity of its development, which, if it isn't done in a relatively clean way, will be disastrous for the entire world, since there's simply so many people. And so there's an urgency to it, there's a desire to do it, but there's a resource gap that India doesn't have the means to fill on its own. And so that places it in many ways in alignment, as I said, with countries of the global south.
Well, let's then move up a higher level here, and if you could tell us what you see as the main drivers of solidarity between India and the United States. How would you prioritize them? And how significant are they relative to the impediments in this kind of relationship? I mean, it's very complicated now. The circumstances are very complicated, and so which way is it going to go? And so that's the key question, it seems to me. And a balance sheet, if you could.
Sure. Well, this can get very complicated very quickly, so I'll try to keep it relatively simple. But one of the things to note is that over the past, let's say, 5 to 10 years, if you had to identify the single most effective driver that has brought India more willingly into a strategic embrace of its relationship with the United States, it would be China. It would be China's actions along India's border that have, that in summer of 2020 amounted to actual violence, greatest loss of life in 4 decades along that border, that reflect Chinese investments in military infrastructure and capabilities along that border that India sees as quite threatening to its interests, and to a Chinese lack of willingness to negotiate in ways that India perceives as being transparent and non-threatening, all of which have amounted to what India's external affairs minister has repeatedly described as an abnormal situation along the border. You take all of that, and you can reason by analogy, you can see similar actions that China has taken in terms of being its more aggressive approach in other parts of Asia. And you can see how that's affected, say, states in Southeast Asia. They've also found China to be more threatening, or how Japan has responded, and so on. And you can see that this has made India quite nervous and open to, as I say, a partnership with the United States in ways that you have never seen before. So that's point one. Point two is, as I tried to explain before, the U.S.-India relationship is always, people describe it sometimes as a built on a three-point stool, or a three-legged stool. So one leg is the strategic or military component, which I've already discussed. That's quite strong. One leg was supposed to be the economy, and one leg is supposed to be politics. And on the economic side, as I said, we've seen some opportunities for growth. We've seen some success, but not vast and rapid expansion of trade and investment in the ways that would really provide enormous ballast to the relationship. India-U.S. trade and investment is not significantly, is often around or less than that with China. despite India's concerns about China as a threat. So we haven't seen huge growth there. There are efforts in the works, things like the new Biden administration initiative on critical and emerging technologies. So there are ways to try to spur economic and commercial ties with India that people are, I think, significantly invested in. That is, politically they're invested, and they'd like to see a great deal more. So there's still potential there, but it hasn't taken off in the way that some might have hoped. Certainly, as we had hoped we would see, 20 odd years ago, when either the Clinton or the Bush administration were getting going. That's been a laggard in our efforts. And then on the politics side, back during the Clinton and Bush administration and during the Vajpayee BJP government and then subsequently the Manmohan Singh governments, it was quite common to simply assume that because India was an enormous democracy and because the United States sees itself as a leading democracy, that they were naturally aligned politically in ways that would never come undone. And that has changed. It's changed on our side to some extent. There were a lot of questions about American democracy in India and elsewhere during the Trump administration, but now it's increasingly also changed on the Indian side, where I'm sure many of you have seen there have been a lot of criticisms of the direction that the current Indian government has taken, and steps that it's taken that look increasingly less democratic in terms of its practices at home, its protections of media, the opportunities for free expression, and so on, minority rights in particular, that have led to, I would say, a weakening of that leg of the stool. Not a destruction of it. I think there's still a healthy understanding here, and the Biden administration will repeatedly say that India continues to be a democracy. All democracies have challenges, and it's up to democracies to resolve and deal with those challenges on their own. But there is greater concern there, certainly, than there was in the past. So that's my report card, pros and cons, and some of the obstacles, I think, in the political side are I think, important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's one of the things that you run across when you look at countries that are vacillating in Asia between the United States and China is they don't look at the United States as reliable. They see the situation in the United States as subject to change. They say, okay, we sort of like the policies of this Biden administration. They're looking for allies and partners. They're generally constructive in dealing with them. But this wasn't the case in the previous government. And that person is going to run for re-election or is running for re-election. And so that might be different. Now, the Indians did seem to like Mr. Trump. I mean, Mr. Modi had a big summit meeting. He came to the United States. And they met him in a football stadium in Houston and had a great time. So maybe that wouldn't make any difference, but it certainly makes a difference in other parts of Asia. And I just wondered about India.
Yeah, I think there's a depth of skepticism about the United States and India that we should recognize, and this isn't simply a matter of the point about who's in charge in Washington at any given time. There is a sense, widespread and maybe surprising to some Americans for some of the reasons that we've already discussed, that America looks like, our politicians talk about wanting to help India, wanting to support India's rise. And yet, you will, if you go to New Delhi and other parts of India, you will hear a skepticism about whether America is a good partner, whether India should tie itself to America. Some of this has a very long history, kind of a Cold War, or even before that, a kind of a post-colonial view of the United States as an exploitative great power on the world stage. That is not to be trusted, that may talk a good game, but is actually hypocritical in its application, that has been a partner, among other things, to the Chinese at various points, and then even worse, to the Pakistanis at many points, and simply can't be trusted from an Indian point of view. So that's a kind of a broad distrust that is only gradually maybe being dispelled by this series of U.S. efforts to court India and to do more with India, to make that kind of, we often hear this term, make habits of cooperation stronger, right? So some of that hasn't changed. The other part, though, is yes, there is this fear that the United States kind of comes and goes. And so as surprising as this may be, one of the questions that I sometimes get in India is whether the United States might seek out what is sometimes described as a G2. That is, the United States might cut a deal with China to effectively have spheres of influence in the world, and to let China have its own sphere of influence in Asia, and the United States will have its friends and partners elsewhere. And the United States might do this because it doesn't care so much about what actually happens in Asia. And India would be, would suffer the consequences of an unbridled and unchallenged China in Asia. And when I come back and I say, in Washington, there's a pretty firm consensus that has emerged about competing with China, including competing with China in Asia, I get a, well, we'll see response. So there is a lot of skepticism, and it is not limited to just politics here. One last one would be Afghanistan, right? The U.S. experience in Afghanistan was tragic and devastating, and I think left all of us dissatisfied, if not worse. But India's, at least many in India, the lesson that they have learned is, yeah, the United States tried that for a period of time, but made a whole bunch of promises about how Afghanistan was going to turn out. And now we're back to where we started. So just how trustworthy and stalwart is the United States? I'm not making that criticism myself. I think there are other ways to see it, but I think that's a fairly commonly held view in India.
Great. Well, since you're here and you're an expert on Pakistan as well, I really want to ask you about this as well. In other words, and this gets into a broader question. When you look at India's security calculations, they have internal problems that they have to worry about, but then the periphery of India, and this is what China exploits in many cases, to give India a hard time in its periphery, but it really does have a big problem with Pakistan. And now Afghanistan, the situation there doesn't seem to be working in India's favor. And so how serious is that? And how serious is Pakistan viewed in India today? Is it preoccupied? Is it it's not seen as terribly important at this point? Or what's the reading of that? And perhaps any other periphery issues that you would see, but those are the two big ones that I see at this point, and I wonder how important are they?
There's a really interesting kind of vacillation in Indian attitudes, or a kind of a mixed view on Pakistan, because on the one hand, I will repeatedly hear from Indian policymakers and experts, we're not concerned about Pakistan. Pakistan's a two-bit power that really can't challenge India, really can't harm India. We basically got that one under control. And look at Pakistan's falling apart on its own. So what's the concern there? So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, there are two kind of other versions of the story. One is that India actually continues to devote a tremendous amount of its military capabilities to the Pakistan front. So there's obviously a continued concern about the actual threat that Pakistan is perceived to represent to India. And increasingly, Pakistan is, by many Indians, portrayed as a kind of an extension of the China threat. So there is, as I've heard over the years, an increasing tendency among Indians to basically combine the two. To say that, Pakistan and China, they've been partners for a very long time, but increasingly that partnership is becoming much more like kind of an alliance, one in which the Chinese will call the shots, the Pakistanis will effectively become a vassal to the Chinese. They will increasingly allow the Chinese access in terms of bases and ports to project its power to India's other front, and will pose a direct threat to India that way. Now, I think it's all, I mean, these are reasonable concerns, but of course, as with everything else, it tends to be a little more complicated. One of the interesting puzzles over the past few years has been the India-Pakistan ceasefire, because there has been a ceasefire along their border, which has persisted for several years now. And so there's a question as to why is that? If Pakistan is sort of an accessory to Chinese power, why, among other things, did Pakistan not do more when India and China went toe-to-toe along their border? Why didn't China use that as an opportunity to create more trouble with India? Why did Pakistan kind of stay to the side? And why is it that Pakistan remains inclined to downplay the extent to which China has access to its territory? Why does Pakistan continue to want to sort of push its independence in those areas? So these are all puzzles if Pakistan is really just a kind of an extension of Chinese power. And I do go to Pakistan and I ask Pakistanis why all this is. And among the answers that I receive is that Pakistan, like basically every other country on earth, doesn't want to be bossed around by anybody. And so while they have very few options, increasingly the United States not much of an option as a partner to Pakistan, they also don't want to just become a junior vassal or tool or proxy of Beijing. In part because that would force them to do what China wants, even when that might be painful for Pakistan's leaders. And so Pakistan is trying to avoid falling in entirely on one side or the other. And just in terms of why Pakistan hasn't sort of taken advantage of the India-China disputes to create more trouble, Pakistan doesn't want to get beaten up by India, which they're concerned about, or to be sort of punished by India in that context as an indirect means to respond to Chinese provocations. So Pakistan doesn't want to paint a target on its own back and find itself in an even worse situation. So they're quite sort of concerned about the risks that they run in ways that I think need to be appreciated as well.
Afghanistan.
Oh, sorry, Afghanistan. So Afghanistan is bad in terms of its current trajectory, is, as far as I can tell, bad for everyone, except perhaps some of the Taliban and some ISIS. Everyone is a loser. At the top of the list, of course, are the people of Afghanistan, so we shouldn't forget that. We, far away from Afghanistan, are still losers because I think our security is adversely affected, and I think we were dealt a pretty big black eye by that entire experience. So we come out looking the worse for wear. Pakistan probably is the next biggest loser after Afghanistan.
Really?
Yeah. Pakistan is finding that despite its sort of sense that it was clever and sort of double games that it had played throughout the past decades of supporting the Taliban, but also providing access to us and so on and so forth. I think we all know that story. But I think that the Pakistanis are now finding that the new government in Kabul is completely unhelpful in ways that some of them at least did not anticipate. And that the Pakistani Taliban, those who attack Pakistani forces inside of Pakistan, have friends and allies and accomplices back in Afghanistan and are continuing to enjoy that kind of support, which is very dangerous for the state of Pakistan, potentially very costly. So just as many of us have warned Pakistan over many, many years that it was playing a dangerous game that eventually would come home to roost, now I'm afraid it is. And now Pakistan has fewer friends and allies, partners, supporters outside of Pakistan to help it. You might say that what's bad for Pakistan is good for India. And in a way, that would be kind of true, except, India has no long-term positive benefit from a Taliban-led regime in Afghanistan. This likely would eventually prove threatening to India as well. And so I think it's that's a short-term way of seeing this evolution. India does actually, I'd say at this moment, Kabul is more friendly to India than it is to Pakistan. And India has more opportunities to cultivate friends and partners with the Taliban than Pakistan does at the moment. But I think that could shift rapidly, and so I certainly wouldn't counsel India to see this as a major strategic advantage. But Pakistan is clearly occupied by the threat posed in Afghanistan at the moment.
Very interesting. It really is a blow for them. I mean, Pakistan worked really hard to
They thought they
stay
had
on the
succeeded,
good side.
and it didn't work out that way.
Amazing. Oh, well, this is fascinating. Let's look at the other side of this, and as far as India's cooperation with, and the influence of a country like Japan and Australia, and these countries in the Quad, and what India is prepared to do in conjunction with them and the United States. And the handout that we have talks about India joining with G7 meetings. Are they going to join with G7 meetings? That would be very interesting. And so we hear a lot about the BRICS, and we hear a lot about expansion, and we hear a lot about the SCO, but we don't hear too much about what the Indians are doing with the Quad powers. It looks like they're a little bit further behind what Japan wants to do and what Australia wants to do, but I'm not sure about that, and I don't know the reasons why. So I was wondering about that.
Yeah, I don't know that I can speculate so much on the G7 bit, but the Quad part I'm pretty comfortable with, and this has got now about almost 20 years of history behind it. I mean, the Quad, is increasingly something that gets thrown around. I don't think that most people really know what the Quad is or does. Sometimes I wonder if I know what the Quad is or does. I know that it has India and Japan, Australia, and the United States. I know that it originally came about as a consequence of the tsunami back to 2004, and was a quick way for 4 countries that had capabilities, naval capabilities, humanitarian delivery, and so on, capabilities in the region to come together to coordinate their efforts. And after they did that pretty effectively, they said, we ought to do more of this. And so I recall, because this was happening at a time when I was in government, a lot of efforts to kind of inspire more quadrilateral cooperation on things that we described as kind of common mutual interests in the region, but were not really alliance-type activities, aimed to helping people, but not against anyone, right? And it was very clear from the beginning that to keep India on board, at times to keep Australia on board, and sometimes even to keep the United States and Japan on board, you could not frame their cooperation in anti-Chinese terms. You had to be very careful about it because of the sensitivities in any one of those 4 Quad countries at any given time. They didn't want to pick a fight with Beijing. And they didn't perceive that the value of the Quad was so great that it was worth picking a fight with Beijing. What has happened over time is, as I said before, each of those countries, I think, on its own timetable, has found China they have begun to perceive the risks posed by China to be greater, and they have seen the value or the potential value of aligning themselves in this grouping as being greater, but they still tend to frame it in positive terms, practical, cooperative terms. It is fundamentally different, at least now, from, say, the US-Australia Treaty Alliance, or the US-India Alliance. And it is also, everything that they do is couched in non-military and only sort of vaguely security terms. So they had a strong initiative with respect to vaccine dispersal in Asia. They're now talking about maritime domain awareness, that is better understanding what's happening at sea throughout the Indo-Pacific. But they don't talk about it as like Chinese submarine chasing. They talk about it as helping fishermen or doing other positive things for the region that will help people who are, say, lost at sea and so on. So there's still a strong desire to avoid having this thing be perceived as a counter-China approach. And yet, the Chinese have repeatedly described it as a new Asian NATO. So there's a kind of a game, there's a subtext here. And the subtext is that it is some kind of a, big democracies of Asia aligning together, trying to do more stuff together, and China's not invited. But then there's the official text, which is this has nothing to do with China. That's at foot. So that's where I think, to try to circle back around, that's the kind of game that India is playing. And I think one last thing is it's fundamentally different from like AUKUS, right? The US, UK, Australia deal to help Australia to develop nuclear propulsion for its submarines, new nuclear submarines. That is very directly a security-focused initiative. And right now, Quad is not that. So we can say more about what it's not than precisely what it is in some ways.
Does India get benefits directly from Japan? Is very active with India. It's been that way for a long time. Do they get? Japan is known for providing economic incentives
Absolutely.
of one sort or another. Do they get a lot from Japan? Is it important for India?
They do, and they have been for decades. That is, the Japanese have been involved in investments in India for decades. They have been involved in infrastructure investment in the same way that Japan has been heavily involved throughout Asia in terms of its aid and investment approach. But the breakthroughs, we now have, here in Washington, we've become more inclined to talk about the Indo-Pacific. This didn't used to exist really as an American term. We even have the Indo-Pacific Command now instead of Pacific Command, right? That, as far as I know, was mainly a Japanese initiative that then got a lot of positive response from the Indians and then gradually made its way back here to the United States. So the India-Japan relationship is tight, but again, it's not an alliance relationship. It's not a security-first relationship. It's a business investment, assistance and support, and a diplomatic relationship first.
One of the elements, and this will be my final question from me, and then we'll have questions from the audience. One of the dimensions of India that's really interesting is the importance of the large number of people in the United States who were born in India, citizens of the United States or permanent residents, an increasing number of students coming from India. We have, and the fact that in Congress, the ethnic lobby, the Indian lobby, is probably the second most important lobby, ethnic lobby in Congress. And so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the importance of that and where's it going? In other words, it seems like the immigration is increasing, and so I just was get your sense of this.
Yeah, I think there are a huge number of Indians studying in the United States. A huge number of Indians have come to the United States to work and to power some of America's greatest innovations over the past couple of generations in terms of Silicon Valley, in terms of big American businesses. I mean, the interconnection, this is not strictly a new story. There's, I can't remember the title of it, there's a very good history of how the United States invested in the IITs, the Indian Institutes of Technology, decades ago, now generations ago. They produced outstanding scientists and so on, who in turn came back to the United States and gradually made their way into some of America's top scientific and technological institutions, and then propelled some major breakthroughs and developments in the American economy. So that's been a part of our story for quite some time. It is growing in terms of volume. I think there's a question in many, having worked in an institution of higher education, it's not a surprise we're facing a bit of a question mark over the numbers of Chinese students coming to the United States. There are questions about, if you were to see fewer of those, where else would you see students coming from? There are many Indians coming in, many other Asians coming in. So there are opportunities there. Mm-hmm. There's another big question mark about Americans going to India. There are many people who say, it's got to be a two-way street. In order for this to be a closer relationship, there needs to be more of that. Are there opportunities for American higher education institutions to establish themselves in India or jointly in partnerships with Indian institutions? So there's a lot of effort there. With respect to the Indian lobby, yes, I think that many American politicians see India as good politics. There's no downside to being pro-India on Capitol Hill at the moment, as far as I can tell. There is a general consensus, and I think a pretty strong one, for a positive sense about India. The depth of that is a little less clear, and there is here too some complexity. The Indian diaspora community in the United States is not fully aligned either in terms of American domestic politics or Indian politics. And so as India's domestic politics are fraught and contentious, that can play back into the diaspora community here. And as America's politics, you mentioned the Howdy Modi event that Modi and Trump hosted in Houston. These things can be points of contention as well, and politicization of the relationship, and that can be dangerous. So it's not all just a rosy, positive story. You can see problems emerging from that potential politicization one way or the other. That is, we picking sides in India or them picking sides here in the United States.
Fascinating, fascinating. Well, listen, I think I asked all these questions. It's time for the questions from the audience. I'd ask you to, if you do have a question, raise your hand, and I'll call on you, and just identify yourself and speak clearly, and we'll get it recorded.
Hello, I'm Satvik Daniela. I am a grad student here at GW. I guess my question would be, in the last India-China confrontation on the border at Tawang, there was reports that the U.S. provided real-time intelligence to the Indian border forces in order to respond. And this kind of signifies a larger intelligence cooperation, the agreement, and just a greater trend. But this came in response to a defensive action of Chinese encroachment on the border. Do you think that the U.S.-India relationship has progressed or will progress enough to tolerate an offensive action at the border? Will that be a wedge between the U.S. and India?
It's a great question, but let me make sure I understand it fully. You're saying an offensive action by India against Chinese forces? Is that what you think?
So currently at Ladakh, there's, I think, out of 60 outposts, 20 cannot be reached by Indian forces anymore. Let's say like an attempt to retake those outposts.
Okay. So one very charitable way to interpret that from an Indian perspective would be a retaking operation that wouldn't necessarily be characterized as offensive. But from a U.S. perspective, that would be seen as a potential provocation, and it would certainly run some risks. Now, I don't want to sit here and claim that I would know the answer to this question about exactly how the White House or the intelligence community would weigh those risks, or precisely where they line up. But my expectation is that both India and the United States are quite risk averse, actually, along this border. And so it's not just a question of would the United States back that Indian move, but would India actually want to undertake that itself? So since I don't have answers to those, it's difficult to say. But I do think that, and all of you should take a look. There have been some interesting reports about precisely this incident in early December. There are claims publicly that the United States should provide actionable real-time intelligence to allow India to have a more capable defense against Chinese forces, and that is something new as far as I know. It does reflect a serious gap in Indian capabilities in terms of border surveillance, which was, as far as I could tell, and which I picked up on my trip to India in September, and before that, was something that was worrying New Delhi quite a lot. Their ability to see what was happening along that border effectively enough to respond to it was limited, and that was even identified then, and Taiwan in particular, as a place where India had concerns. And so I think it's a good development, but I think you're right to put your finger on, where do you go next? Do you see this, how far would you be willing to push? And I will extend the question a little bit to say, if you're the US government, to what extent is it in your interest to see an exacerbation, a worsening of India-China land border disputes? Is that actually in the US interest? There are some people who would suggest, okay, well, the United States is interested maybe in giving China a hard time, maybe distracting China from other theaters, and this is one where maybe India could be helpful to kind of pull China's eye away from, make China feel some pain in the, I might say the soft underbelly of the Chinese state close to some sensitive places like Tibet and Xinjiang, right? So there might be an argument to be made that having India cause China a little bit of trouble there wouldn't be so bad for the United States. There's another argument which I'm a little more sympathetic to, which is that the core U.S. concern with respect to China in Asia and the critical area where India has a significant advantage is at sea. It's along the Indo-Pacific, it's in the maritime space. And that's where, ideally, if we had our druthers, that we would want India to play a greater role and where our partnership with India would be most manifest. But unfortunately, you don't always get to choose where you're going to confront a problem with the Chinese. But in your scenario, India would effectively be making that choice, right? Would be pushing an agenda or taking greater risks along that border. And for the reason I just sketched out, I would anticipate that it actually be more in the U.S. interest to help India find a stable equilibrium along the land border so that it could devote attention to the maritime space over the long term.
Great. A question over here, gentleman there.
Yeah,
Please identify yourself.
Sure. My name is Sayam. I'm an undergrad student studying at the LA School. My question is related back to the issue of climate change that you mentioned a while ago. I know there have been international pressures, especially for China, to reduce emissions, and that's been a role in their policymaking. And I'm sure that India is also somewhat another country that international communities are looking at. And the local government has tried to make pledges and ambitious goals, but I think the reality is also that in development they need energy sources to electrify the country. So do you think there could be an opportunity for international communities or even just the US and India to work together to promote specific renewable energy sources between the two countries and what that might look like?
Yeah, in a word, yes. The one area that seems to already be making a great deal of headway and could go a great deal further is solar. The critical concern in India is about coal. India happens to have a great deal of coal relative to other energy-producing resources, but it's dirty, and the potential of it not only causing problems for climate change, but simply other things like air pollution and so on is very great. And it's also costly to move coal around and so on. So I think we know that coal is not a great solution to India's energy needs, and yet when you have such a huge population, it's growing rapidly, demanding more energy, you use what you've got. So the desire on the rest of the world's part ought to be to find alternatives to coal. So solar is one. The other one is nuclear. And there are obvious problems to nuclear energy. Japan's trouble with Fukushima and other problems we've had elsewhere raises all kinds of concerns about what can go wrong with nuclear energy. But I think there are a lot of people in my view, in the climate change business who are giving a good serious look back to the nuclear option, so to speak. And I think India would be reasonably well positioned for that. And if we go back to the civil nuclear deal that the Bush administration engineered with the Indians, one of the promises of that deal, which has clearly not been realized, was the idea that the United States would export civilian nuclear power plant capabilities to India. This would be good for companies like GE and so on. That hasn't happened at all. And what has happened instead is that the only nuclear power providers in India that have made any headway are the Russians. So we've got a few problems there. So there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of challenge, but I think there are definitely opportunities. And I do think that the Indian government recognizes at some basic level that it will be disastrous for India itself. I mean, climate change is not a problem that India is well prepared to deal with. Indians will suffer from climate change, and Indians are clearly already suffering from climate change. If any of you have been to India's big cities, and I'll be there in a matter of, about a week, I'll be in New Delhi, it's gonna be hot. And that's the new normal. Earlier and earlier every year, climate change is real. So India knows that it has to deal with it.
Let's try a question here then, please.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. My name is Shah. I really hope this isn't a broad question, but my question is, how do you see the Sino-Indian competition developing in South Asia, specifically in post-default Sri Lanka, and also Bangladesh?
Yeah, great question. And I wish I were better able to answer the specifics of that. I mean, it's an area where some of my colleagues are following very closely, much more than I am, at the U.S. Institute of Peace, particularly in Sri Lanka. There's obviously, in both countries, actually in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, in Nepal, you have always, or for a very long time, seen India perceive itself as the natural regional leader. For those countries, the smaller countries, they would say India is the big bully next door, hegemonic pretensions and a desire to tell them what to do. And India, for a very long time, could more or less do that without much concern about external involvement. One bit of, we were talking earlier about India's skepticism of the United States. One measure of that is throughout much of the Cold War, India saw the United States as a kind of a nosy busybody, an imperialist power trying to get into its business by playing games with the Sri Lankans or in Nepal or Bangladesh and so on. And so India was sort of keeping us at arm's length and wanted to make sure that we didn't muck around in its neighborhood. But now China poses a really serious threat to India and to Indian influence, because China brings, like to some extent we did during the Cold War, but even more, brings something that these countries need and want, which is money, trade, investment, sometimes technologies and other things, and in ways that India has been relatively unprepared to do. Now, it's not simply that the Chinese come in altruistically to help the Sri Lankans and to make their country better. Obviously, there are many other things at work, and that has created opportunities for India to sort of reclaim some influence. India will always be Sri Lanka's next door neighbor, and so it always will continue to have some political influence and some interest in terms of wanting to see stability in Sri Lanka. And China is a little bit more distant. And the games that China has played, and particularly here we talk about debt trap diplomacy, but in shorthand, Chinese loans to Sri Lanka, which then need to be repaid, and that has gotten Sri Lanka into some trouble. And Sri Lanka has gotten itself in trouble, but the Chinese have been less helpful than the Sri Lankans would like, and that again creates opportunities for India. So it is a tussle, a give and take. One last point on this: India is shockingly disconnected from its neighborhood in terms of just regional infrastructure, trade and transit infrastructure, so border crossings, canals, roads, trains, and so on, in ways that create opportunities for external powers like China to exploit. And so one of the things, and I heard a great presentation on this by an Indian expert months ago, but one of the things that has been really a new area of focus for the Indian government is to build those types of ties in the region so that China isn't able to sort of sweep in uncontested. And so India will have natural advantages in its neighborhood going forward. So it's a big area. I mean, it's definitely something I encourage you to watch closely. India, even more than the United States, has concerns about what China is doing in South Asia.
Fascinating. Yes, a question here, please.
Hi,
Please identify yourself, please.
my name is Div Paray. How do you think the rise of Hindu nationalism and extremism might affect India's perception on the world stage?
Let me focus out a little bit more. You say India's perception of the world, or the world's perception of India? So, great question. And Hindu nationalism, I mean, most of you probably know, but for those who aren't following this closely, the current Indian government, the BJP government, has always had close ties to an ideology of Hindu nationalism. It has connections, institutional connections, personal connections, professional connections with organizations in India that promote these ideas. And it owes some of its success politically to these connections. And it affects, in many ways, how Indians, including the current Prime Minister, how they see the world, what they want to accomplish in the world, what they think India's place in the world ought to be. And I start there because how India sees itself then gets reflected back in how others perceive India. So if your ideology leads you, in the case of Hindu nationalism, to see that India should be a certain type of leader, so there's a term that's frequently used, Vishwaguru, kind of a world teacher, and that India is naturally positioned to share its wisdom with the world, and that India will take opportunities to be a leader on the world stage in order to do that, then the question is, what is that wisdom? What are the contents of that wisdom? And if the wisdom differs, I think, and this is where I'm getting to, it differs with, say, liberal principles of individual rights or protections for minorities, equal protections, or the types of principles that we typically associate, again, with a sort of liberal internationalist vision for the world. Again, I should say, never actually accomplished fully, but as an aim or aspiration here in the United States. If it differs fundamentally from that, then there will be questions as to how do we respond, right? We'll have doubts about what is India really trying to do? What is its goal for the world? And so I think, India is in a position, and its current leadership are in a position to define better what Hindu nationalism means for their foreign policy. And as they do that, because they're definitely working at it at the domestic level, but as they explain to the rest of the world what Hindu nationalism means in terms of their foreign policy, then we will better understand how to respond to it. And I do have concerns, because I perceive Hindu nationalism as being one of a category of ideologies that are more communal in outlook. That is, they're more about groups than they are about individuals. They're defining the state in terms of a group identity, and it has a religious component to it, but it's also potentially exclusive of certain other religions. And the Muslim minority in India is the most obvious one. And that's created domestic problems, or has given rise to certain issues inside of India. But that will also have complicating factors for India's relations, including with the United States, I think. Just as if and when the United States is more communal in its outlook and less liberal in its outlook, other countries see us differently. So global perceptions will be shaped by what India says it wants to do in the world. And Hindu nationalism is an increasingly central part of that.
Wonderful. Question, the gentleman over there. Yes, please.
Akshat Singh, I work for the India program at CSIS. Great to hear from you, Dr. Sutter and Dr. Markey. At the beginning of the session, you mentioned how India is balancing this position between China and the US and is reaping the benefits of living in a multipolar world. Do you feel the United States' reluctance to engage India on key issues such as CAPSA, such as free trade treaties, even softer issues such as immigration and green cards, H-1B, is pushing India towards China or forcing India to maintain the status quo in which it tries to balance rather than become a natural U.S. ally?
So what I was attempting to say was that I think that would have been India's preferred position. That is to not have to choose between us and the Chinese, to not really have to choose between anybody and anybody, and to navigate its way in a kind of freely navigate its way in a truly warm multipolar system. And then some of the irritants in the U.S.-India relationship that you've identified, that is CASA sanctions imposed or directed toward India for buying Russian manufactured equipment, these kinds of things, or our visa policies, would continue, as I think they do to some extent, to convince India's leaders that we are untrustworthy at some level and that they should be skeptical of us. So those irritations will always crop up. But what I also was trying to say is that, China and China's more aggressive approach toward India has more than anything else pushed India to be concerned that it will have to make or that it will have to slide closer to the United States in response. And if I could, I'd just elaborate on that one little bit more, which is the war in Ukraine has clearly created huge problems for Russia, and in my mind is likely to make Russia a diminished power possibly for decades to come. And if we look at the situation that way and we ask then, barring a fundamental change in terms of Russia's position in the world, a de-Putinization of Russia, and that goes well beyond the single man of Putin, but a real strategic shift on Russia's part, barring that, who does Russia have left? Well, clearly China. But then come back to India. If Russia has been a major partner of yours for some time, and you'd like to continue that, but a Russia that's aligned with China is no longer at all a viable or dependable partner. And so that too is likely to get you, if you're India, to go looking for other options. And while the United States is not the best option in terms of providing low-cost military equipment like the Russians have, certainly a combination of the United States, Europeans, possibly South Koreans, and others can begin to fill the gaps in India's arsenal that will be left, I think, increasingly by the Russians going forward. So that's what I perceive as being kind of the evolution in India's position over the past few years and looking ahead in years to come.
We have time for one more question, right here.
Thank you. My name is Avi Iyer, and the question I had was, it's about the conflicts occurring in the Kashmir region, specifically the Kargil war, but there have been other wars in the past. So obviously, like a war like that could have the potential to be detrimental to both India and Pakistan's economy. So my question is, how long do you think both countries can keep fighting at the border? I know you said there's been a ceasefire of late at the India-Pakistan border, but obviously there's still been local tensions in the Kashmir states in both areas. So how long do you think this battle between the two will keep going, and when do you see a potential full stop of the conflicts?
Great question. It's a sign of the times that in a meeting like this, the India-Pakistan conflict itself, and Kashmir in particular, could come only at the last question. I mean, that used to be the first question, and sometimes the only question that people would want to talk about. And India-Pakistan crisis dynamics are something that certainly have occupied a fair amount of my time over the years. And I'm afraid my answer is a pretty negative one, which is that I don't see India and I don't see Pakistan coming to kind of recognize a peaceful solution to their differences anytime in the near future. I think that India and the Indian government, and I think large parts of the Indian population, have no particular interest in war with Pakistan, but have basically given up on the idea that Pakistan can be, as we say in the Middle East, a partner for peace. that Pakistan is trustworthy and or capable enough to stop using or allowing terrorism to be used against India. I just don't think that Indians have decided that that's plausible or realistic anytime soon. And for their part, I think the Pakistanis are, as I said before, facing such an enormous mess internally in terms of their economy, their politics, their own security, and on their other border with Afghanistan. And I don't think that they have the national wherewithal to sort of push forward a bold agenda with India that would be required to advance anything like true peace or normalization. So I'm not going to say never, but I'm definitely going to say not in the near term. The only positive thing is, though, that with the ceasefire and with Pakistan distracted and hopefully India up to better things, you might see a period of no war or no major war. And frankly, that's not bad. That might be a good bar or a good hope and expectation for at least the years as far as we can play this out.
Well, great. It's time for us to stop here and turn it over to Nicholas for the final discussion. But let me just make a comment or two about the discussion today. To me, this has been remarkably multifaceted and full of interesting insights and rigorous explanations. It's really been a wonderful opportunity to broaden our knowledge about so many different aspects related to U.S.-India relations. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and thank you all for attending. I agree with Professor Sutter that this was a fascinating conversation, and will be continued next week on Monday, April 17th from 8 to 9 p.m. We'll be having an event with Dr. Lauren D. Antonio, who is from the GW Business School. She will be continuing this conversation about India's rise, specifically about their rise in global business. And with that, for the last time, I'd like to say, on behalf of the Alexander Hamilton Society and everyone in the audience here today, thank you both for coming here, and please give them a round of applause. Thank you.